Virginia Hartley learned to count in an unusual way, not with apples or coins like other children, but with names. Names carved into the wooden beam above her bedroom window. Names she whispered each night before sleep came. 12 names by the time she was 8. 17 by the time she was 10. 24 by the time she was 12, the same age when each of those children disappeared. By 1851, when Virginia turned 17, she had carved 43 names into that beam. 43 children who had arrived at Hartley Plantation as infants or toddlers, lived and worked there until they reached 12 years of age, and then simply ceased to exist. No sale records, no bills of lading, no advertisements in the Richmond papers. No mention in her father's meticulous ledgers that documented every bushel of tobacco, every pound of cotton, every sack of grain, every transaction down to the penny. Just gone. Virginia remembered the first time she noticed. She had been 7 years old, playing near the kitchen gardens where the children worked. There was a girl named Ruth, maybe 11 years old, with quick hands and a quicker smile, who was teaching Virginia how to braid sweetgrass into patterns. They would meet in the early mornings when the dew still sat heavy on the tobacco leaves and the air smelled of earth and green things growing. Ruth had a way of making the grass bend and weave that seemed like magic to Virginia's young eyes. One Tuesday morning in June, Virginia went to their usual meeting spot, and Ruth wasn't there. She waited. The sun climbed higher. The dew burned off. Still no Ruth. Virginia asked Ruth's mother, who turned away so quickly her skirt spun. She asked the cook, who said only that child's been sent on and wouldn't meet Virginia's eyes. She asked her father that evening at supper, interrupting his conversation about tobacco prices with a question that made the table go silent. "Father, where did Ruth go?" Thomas Hartley looked at his daughter with mild irritation. "Children should not interrupt their elders, Virginia. Ruth has been sold to a family in Tennessee. That is all you need to know." But Virginia had been in her father's study just the day before yesterday, bringing him his afternoon tea. She had seen the ledger open on his desk, the brown leather one he kept locked in the drawer. She had seen Ruth's name there, written in her father's precise script. And next to it, no entry in the sold to column, just a single word: removed. That night, Virginia took her mother's sewing scissors and carved Ruth's name into the wooden beam above her window. She didn't know why exactly. She just knew that someone should remember. Over the next 10 years, Virginia carved 42 more names. Before we continue with the story of Virginia Hartley and the dark secret that would eventually tear her family apart and shake the foundations of Virginia's plantation society, I want to ask you to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. This is the kind of mystery that demands to be heard in its entirety. A story of one young woman's determination to uncover a truth that everyone around her desperately wanted to keep buried. Leave a comment below telling me what state you're listening from. Are you in Virginia, where this story takes place, or somewhere else? I love knowing where our audience is from. Now let's return to Virginia Hartley in the summer of 1851 as she begins to understand that the disappearances she's been documenting are not random, but part of something far more sinister. The Hartley plantation sat in Tidewater, Virginia, 20 miles west of Richmond, in that stretch of rolling country where the Piedmont meets the coastal plain. It was neither the largest nor the wealthiest estate in Henrico County, but it was old, established in 1784 by Virginia's great-grandfather, Nathaniel Hartley, who had fought at Yorktown and received the land as payment for his service. 300 acres of moderately productive soil, a main house built in the federal style, with white columns that needed painting every 3 years, and quarters for 60 enslaved people who worked the fields and tended the house and kept the whole enterprise running. Virginia's father, Thomas Hartley, was 47 years old in 1851, a man of medium height, with thinning brown hair and the permanent squint of someone who spends too much time reviewing ledgers by candlelight. He was methodical in all things. He rose at 5 each morning, inspected the fields before breakfast, spent his afternoons in his study with his account books, and retired each night at 9 o'clock precisely. He believed in order, in documentation, in the proper management of assets. He kept 3 sets of ledgers. The first, bound in green cloth, recorded crops and equipment, acres planted, bushels harvested, tools purchased, repairs needed. The second, bound in red leather, detailed household expenses, candles bought, fabric purchased, servants' winter shoes, the cost of sugar and coffee and tea. The third, bound in brown leather and kept in a locked drawer of his mahogany desk, recorded what he called his human inventory. Virginia had seen this third ledger many times. Her father was not secretive about it within the family. The ledger was simply a fact of plantation life, as ordinary as the crop records. Each page was divided into neat columns: name, age, sex, value, acquired from, date of acquisition. Further along, another section detailed sales: name, age, price, sold to, date of sale, purpose. Thomas Hartley believed that a well-run plantation was one where every asset could be accounted for at any moment. He could tell you exactly how many people he owned, their ages, their skills, their monetary value. He could tell you which ones had been born on the plantation and which had been purchased. He could tell you who was likely to run away, marked with a small R next to their names, and who could be trusted with more freedom of movement. He could tell you all of this because he wrote it down, updated it regularly, and reviewed it monthly. This is why Virginia found it so profoundly strange that children kept disappearing from that ledger with no explanation. By the time she was 15, Virginia had started paying very close attention to the pattern. She would sneak into her father's study when he was in the fields, carefully picking the lock on his desk drawer with a hat pin, a skill she had taught herself through patient observation and experimentation. She would open the brown ledger and run her finger down the columns, looking for the names she remembered. The children she had played with, talked to, watched grow. They were always there in the acquisition records, always listed with their dates of arrival, their approximate ages, their origins. But in the sales records, there was never a corresponding entry, just that word, removed. Sometimes there was a date, sometimes just the word and nothing else. Virginia began to recognize a pattern in the acquisitions too. Her father would make trips to Richmond 3 or 4 times a year, ostensibly on business. He would leave in the morning with his horse and a small purse of coins and return late at night or sometimes the following day. He never brought wagons. He never mentioned auctions. But within a few days of his return, there would be a new child on the plantation, always between the ages of 3 and 5, always described in the ledger as healthy specimen or well-formed or intelligent appearance. These children received different treatment from the others. They worked lighter tasks, kitchen garden, water carrying, helping with laundry. They received better rations. And most strikingly, they were taught to read and write. This last fact was significant. In 1831, after Nat Turner's rebellion sent shockwaves through the South, Virginia had passed laws making it illegal to teach enslaved people to read or write. The penalty for doing so was a fine or imprisonment. Most plantation owners complied with the law, seeing literacy as a dangerous thing that might give enslaved people ideas about freedom. But Thomas Hartley ignored the law. He had an elderly widow named Mrs. Porter come to the plantation twice a week to teach these specific children their letters, their numbers, basic arithmetic. Virginia asked him about it once when she was 14. They were at breakfast, just the two of them. Her mother was still abed with one of her headaches. Virginia had been awake half the night thinking about a boy named James, who had disappeared the week before, just after his 12th birthday. "Father," she said, spreading preserves on her biscuit, trying to sound casual, "why do you have Mrs. Porter teach some of the children to read? Isn't that against the law now?" Her father looked up from his newspaper. "The law is for people who can't manage their property correctly. An educated servant is worth more, Virginia. That's simple economics. Worth more when you sell them?" "Precisely. But you don't sell them, Father. At least I've never heard you mention it. Where do they go?" Thomas Hartley's expression changed subtly. His eyes, which had been relaxed and slightly amused, went cold and flat. "That is not a subject for young ladies to concern themselves with. Eat your breakfast." Virginia ate her breakfast, but she didn't stop thinking about it. By the spring of 1851, Virginia had developed what she thought of as her private investigation. She kept notes in a journal that she hid beneath a loose floorboard under her bed. She recorded the names of children as they arrived, their approximate ages, any distinguishing characteristics. She noted the dates of her father's trips to Richmond. She documented when children disappeared and tried to calculate the exact age at which it happened. The pattern was undeniable. Every child who arrived between ages 3 and 5 would disappear between ages 12 and 13. Sometimes they stayed a few months past their 12th birthday. Sometimes only a few weeks. But they never reached 13. Never. Virginia thought about this constantly. She thought about it during her embroidery lessons with her mother. She thought about it during church services, staring at the back of her father's head as the minister droned on about obedience and duty. She thought about it at night, lying in bed and staring at the names carved above her window, names that glowed faintly in the moonlight filtering through her curtains. She thought about what it meant, the careful selection of young children, the better treatment, the education, the systematic disappearance at age 12. Where were they going? Who was buying them? And why would someone pay more for an educated child when education was illegal and supposedly dangerous? The answer, when it began to come to her, was one she didn't want to believe. In early June 1851, Virginia made a decision. She would follow her father on his next trip to Richmond. She would find out where he was really going and what he was really doing, because whatever it was, 43 children had vanished into it, and Virginia could no longer pretend she didn't notice. The opportunity came on June 9th. At breakfast, her father announced he would be traveling to Richmond the following day on business. Virginia told her mother she would be visiting her friend Catherine Stewart, who lived on a neighboring plantation 3 miles away. It was a lie. Virginia had never lied to her mother before, and the guilt sat heavy in her stomach like a stone. But she didn't see another choice. That night, Virginia prepared. She laid out her riding clothes, a dark blue dress that wouldn't show dirt, sturdy boots, a bonnet with a wide brim to shade her face. She packed a small bag with water and some bread and cheese she had taken from the kitchen. She went to bed early but didn't sleep, lying awake and watching the square of moonlight creep across her floor as the hours passed. At 4 in the morning she rose and dressed in the dark. She crept downstairs, avoiding the steps that creaked, 3rd from the top, 7th from the bottom. She slipped out through the back door, past the kitchen, across the yard to the stables. The horses stirred as she entered, but she spoke softly to them, and they settled. She saddled her mare, Juniper, as quietly as she could, her hands shaking slightly. By the time her father emerged from the house at 5:30, Virginia was already hidden in the woods that bordered the main road to Richmond. She had chosen her spot carefully, far enough back that she wouldn't be seen, but close enough that she could see anyone passing on the road. She waited, listening to the birds wake and begin their morning songs, watching the sky lighten from black to gray to pale blue. Her father rode past at 6 o'clock. Virginia waited 10 minutes, counting her heartbeats, and then followed. The road to Richmond was well-traveled but not crowded at this hour. Virginia stayed far back, sometimes losing sight of her father around curves or over hills, then catching glimpses of him ahead. The morning was already warm, promising another sweltering Virginia summer day. Sweat prickled on Virginia's back beneath her dress. Juniper's hooves raised small puffs of dust from the dry road. They had been traveling for perhaps 45 minutes when Thomas Hartley did something unexpected. Instead of continuing toward Richmond, he turned off the main road onto a smaller path that led into dense woods. Virginia almost missed the turn. The path was barely visible, just 2 ruts in the undergrowth, easy to overlook if you weren't looking for it. Virginia dismounted and tied Juniper to a tree well off the main road, where she wouldn't be visible to any other travelers. Then she followed the path on foot, moving as quietly as she could through the underbrush. The woods here were thick with oak and pine and sweet gum, the canopy blocking out much of the sun. The temperature dropped noticeably in the shade. The air smelled of leaf mold and something else, something damp and rotten that Virginia couldn't identify. She could hear her father's horse ahead, the sound of hooves on the soft forest floor, the jingle of tack. She followed the sound more than the sight, staying well back, placing her feet carefully to avoid snapping twigs. After perhaps a mile, the woods began to thin. Virginia slowed, moving from tree to tree, peering ahead. She could see a clearing through the branches, and in that clearing, a structure. It wasn't a house. It was more like a barn or a large shed, built of weathered gray wood that looked like it had been standing there for decades. The roof was shingled with wooden shakes that had gone mossy on the north side. There were no windows that Virginia could see, just a door in front and what might be another door in back. There was nothing else in the clearing. No other buildings, no fields, no signs of human habitation beyond this one strange structure alone in the woods. Her father's horse was tied to a post outside the front door. Virginia circled around through the trees, looking for a better vantage point, a way to see what was happening without being seen herself. The building had no windows, which made it difficult, but as she worked her way around to the back, she saw that there was indeed a second door there, and it was slightly ajar. Virginia crept closer, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. She pressed herself against the weathered wood of the building's back wall and listened. Voices, men's voices, her father's and someone else's she didn't recognize. "You're late, Hartley." The unknown man's voice had a nasal quality, irritated. The roads were muddy from yesterday's rain. It slowed my progress. Her father's voice unruffled. "Is the merchandise ready for inspection?" Virginia felt cold despite the heat. Merchandise, that's what they called them. Not children. Merchandise. "He's prepared according to your specifications," her father replied. 12 years old as of last month, healthy, strong, intelligent. He can read at a 6th grade level, write clearly and calculate figures better than most white children his age. Good. My buyer in Charleston specifically requested someone educated. You'd be surprised how many prefer them that way now. They're willing to pay premium prices for literacy. A pause. "They say it's more satisfying when the merchandise understands what's being done." Virginia's blood turned to ice in her veins. She pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from making a sound. What's being done? What did that mean? What was being done to these children? The price we discussed. Her father's voice was businesslike, discussing a child's fate the way he might discuss the price of tobacco. $800. Twice what you'd get at public auction, as promised. But then, we're not just buying the merchandise, are we, Hartley? We're buying discretion. No papers, no records, no trail. As far as the world is concerned, this child never existed. The sound of footsteps inside the building. Virginia realized someone was approaching the back door. She ran as quietly as she could back into the trees and threw herself down behind a massive oak tree. Her dress caught on something, a thorny vine, and she heard it tear, but she didn't stop. The back door swung open fully. The man who emerged was tall and thin, dressed in a dark coat despite the heat, with a face like a ferret, narrow and pointed. He was holding the arm of a child. Virginia recognized him. Samuel, one of the kitchen garden boys. He had turned 12 3 weeks ago. Virginia had carved his name into her beam just yesterday, somehow knowing, that he would be next. Samuel looked confused. Not frightened yet, just confused, like he was still trying to understand what was happening. "Mr. Hartley," he was saying. "Sir, you said you were taking me to Richmond to—" "Quiet, boy." Her father's voice, sharp as a whip crack. The thin man led Samuel to a wagon that Virginia hadn't noticed before, partially hidden by trees on the far side of the clearing. It was a closed wagon, the kind used for transporting goods you didn't want seen. He opened the back and gestured for Samuel to climb in. Samuel hesitated, and the man put a hand on his shoulder, not rough but firm, and guided him in. Then he closed the door and locked it with a key from his pocket. Virginia watched as the two men returned to the building. She heard the clink of coins, the rustle of paper money being counted, business being conducted, a child's life being bought and sold for $800, and the promise of secrecy. After perhaps 10 minutes, the thin man emerged again, climbed onto the wagon, and drove away. The wagon headed deeper into the woods, on a path Virginia couldn't see from her hiding place. Her father came out moments later, locked the building's front door with a key he hung on a nail under the eaves. Virginia noted this detail without quite knowing why, mounted his horse, and rode back the way he had come. Virginia stayed behind her oak tree for a long time after both men were gone. She was shaking violently, though the day was hot. Her stomach was churning. She thought she might vomit, but managed to keep it down. When she finally stood, her legs were stiff, and her dress was damp with sweat and covered in bits of leaf and bark. She walked back through the woods to where she had left Juniper. The mare whickered softly when she saw Virginia, and Virginia pressed her face against the horse's warm neck and breathed in the familiar smell of hay and horse and home. She felt like crying, but found she couldn't. The horror she felt was too large for tears. It sat in her chest like a physical weight, crushing and cold. Virginia rode home slowly, letting Juniper pick her own pace. Her mind was churning through what she had witnessed, trying to make sense of it, trying to understand. Her father was selling children, but not through normal channels. He was selling them secretly, with no documentation, to buyers who wanted no record of the transaction. Children who had been specifically prepared, educated, made more valuable. And the buyer had said something that made Virginia feel physically ill, more satisfying when they understand what's being done. What was being done to them? What happened to children sold with no papers, no trail, no legal existence? Virginia's imagination conjured horror she didn't want to contemplate. She thought about the stories she had heard, whispered among the enslaved people on the plantation when they didn't know she was listening. Stories about what happened to young slaves, especially educated ones, in the Deep South. Stories about wealthy men with specific tastes, specific desires. Stories that made Virginia's skin crawl. When she got home, she went straight to her room, claiming exhaustion from her ride to Catherine's. She sat on her bed and stared at the beam above her window with the 43 names carved into it. She thought about Samuel, locked in that wagon, being transported to Charleston and then to who knew where. She thought about all the children before him. 43 children who were out in the world somewhere, suffering in ways she couldn't imagine and didn't want to. Virginia realized she had a choice to make. She could pretend she had never followed her father, never witnessed what she saw, never learned the truth. She could carve Samuel's name into her beam and continue with her life, marry whoever her father chose for her, inherit this plantation built on horror, and look away like everyone else did. Or she could do something about it. The question was, what could she possibly do? Virginia spent the next 3 weeks in a state of suspended horror. She went through her daily routines like an automaton, helping her mother supervise the house servants, doing her needlework, reading improving books in the parlor, attending church on Sunday. But her mind was elsewhere. She kept seeing Samuel's confused face as he was led to the wagon. She kept hearing the thin man's words, more satisfying when they understand. She thought about going to the authorities, but which authorities? The sheriff was Jeremiah Boone, a friend of her father's who came to dinner once a month and laughed too loudly at Thomas Hartley's jokes. The county magistrate was Harold Winslow, who owed her father money from a bad investment in railroad stock. The minister was dependent on plantation owners for his salary and would never risk his position by accusing one of them of wrongdoing. Virginia lived in a world where men like her father made the rules, enforced the rules, and benefited from the rules. A world where enslaved people had no legal recourse and no rights that white people were bound to respect. A world where even a white girl of good family had no real power. But she couldn't do nothing. She couldn't just watch as another child disappeared in September and another in December, and more and more and more, stretching into the future. Virginia began to form the skeleton of a plan. It was desperate and possibly foolish, but it was something. First, she needed to understand the scope of what her father was doing. How long had this been going on? How many children? Where were they being sent? Who were the buyers? She started by talking to people on the plantation, or more accurately, by listening. She had learned that direct questions got her nowhere. People clamped up, changed the subject, suddenly remembered urgent work that needed doing. But if she was quiet and patient, if she positioned herself in the right places at the right times, she could hear things. She learned that everyone knew about the disappearing children. Not the details, perhaps, but the basic fact. They knew the children didn't come back. They knew not to ask questions. And they knew, with the resigned certainty of people who have no power over their own lives, that there was nothing anyone could do about it. Been happening since before I was born, Virginia heard one of the older women say to another as they hung laundry one afternoon. Virginia was sitting in the shade of the back porch, ostensibly reading but actually eavesdropping. "My mama told me about it," said old Master Hartley, the current master's grandfather. "He's the one who started it." "Lord have mercy." The other woman shook her head. "How many children, you reckon?" "Dozens. Maybe hundreds over all these years. My mama said the old master found out he could get more money selling children quiet-like than he could at public auction. No questions asked, no papers needed. Some people, they want what they want, and they're willing to pay for nobody to know about it. It's evil, the second woman replied. Pure evil. Those babies get treated nice for their whole lives, get taught things, get fed good, and then... She paused, seeing Virginia on the porch. Both women fell silent. Virginia pretended not to notice, keeping her eyes on her book. But her hands were shaking so badly, she had to grip the book tight to keep it steady. That night, Virginia went to the quarters after dark. It was something she had never done before. White family members didn't visit the quarters, especially not at night, especially not unaccompanied. But Virginia needed information, and she needed help, and she didn't know where else to turn. She knocked on the door of a cabin near the edge of the quarters. A woman named Dinah answered, one of the kitchen workers, mother to several children. Virginia had chosen her specifically because Dinah had a son named Marcus, who was 11 years old. Marcus would turn 12 in March. He was running out of time. Miss Virginia? Dinah looked alarmed, glancing past Virginia into the darkness. Is something wrong? Do you need... I need to talk to you, Virginia said quietly. Please, it's about Marcus. Dinah's face went carefully blank, expressionless. She stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind her so her children wouldn't hear. What about Marcus? He turns 12 in March, doesn't he? Dinah said nothing, but Virginia saw her jaw tighten, saw her hands clench into fists at her sides. I know what happens, Virginia continued. I followed my father. I saw. I know where they take the children and why there are no records. Dinah's eyes went wide with fear. Miss Virginia, you can't talk about this. If your father finds out, you know. I want to stop it. The words hung in the humid night air. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Closer, the sound of cicadas was deafening, their song rising and falling in waves. Virginia and Dinah stared at each other. I want to stop it, Virginia repeated. I don't know how yet, but I can't stand by and watch Marcus disappear like all the others. Don't you want to save him? Of course I want to save him. Dinah's voice was fierce now, barely above a whisper but full of desperate intensity. He's my son. He's my baby. But wanting and doing are different things, Miss Virginia. You're talking about going against your own father, against the whole way things are done. What do you think you can do? You're 17 years old, and a woman besides. Nobody's going to listen to you. And if your father finds out you're planning something... She shook her head. He'd send you away, married off to some man in another state, locked up, declared insane. White women who make trouble have ways of disappearing too, Miss Virginia. Different ways than us, but just as permanent. Maybe, Virginia said, but I have to try. Will you help me? Dinah looked at her for a long time. Virginia saw calculation in her eyes, and hope, and fear, and the desperate, aching love of a mother for her son. Finally, she said very quietly, "What do you need?" Over the next several weeks, Virginia and Dinah formed an unlikely alliance. They spoke in whispers, in stolen moments when no one else was around. Dinah told Virginia everything she knew about the disappeared children, where they had come from originally, how they had been treated, what had been said about them before they vanished. Your grandfather, he started it back in the 20s, Dinah explained one afternoon when they were alone in the kitchen. The other workers were outside in the garden. Times were hard after the revolution. Tobacco prices were down, the land was getting worn out. He was looking for ways to make extra money. Someone, I don't know who, told him there were buyers who would pay premium prices for certain kinds of merchandise. She couldn't quite bring herself to say children. Young ones specifically. Ones who had been raised right, taught things, made valuable. He started small, just 1 or 2 a year. But it was profitable, and by the time your father took over the plantation in 29, it was just how things were done. Where do they come from? Virginia asked. The children, I mean. I know some are born here, but not all of them. Your father buys them special. He goes to estate sales in other counties, to auctions in Richmond and Petersburg. Always looks for young children, 3 to 5 years old. Has to be healthy, has to look intelligent. He brings them back here and has them raised gentle-like. Better food, lighter work. Gets them educated, which is illegal now, but your father doesn't care about laws when there's money to be made. He's preparing them, you see, making them more valuable for his special buyers. Virginia felt sick. And the buyers? Who are they? Dinah's expression was grim. That I don't know exactly, but I've heard things over the years. Rich men mostly. Men from Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans. Men who want slaves for particular purposes, things that can't be done legally or openly. Some want house servants they can educate without breaking the law in their own states. Some want— She paused, clearly struggling with how to say it. Some want children for reasons that don't bear thinking about, Miss Virginia. That's why they don't want papers. Papers mean records, and records mean questions, and questions might lead to trouble. Virginia's hands were shaking. She gripped the edge of the kitchen table to steady them. The man I heard in the woods, he mentioned Charleston. That's where the trading happens. Charleston, New Orleans, sometimes Memphis. Your father brings the children to that building in the woods, and a middleman takes them from there. The middleman deals with the actual buyers. That way your father's hands stay clean, you see. He can claim ignorance if anyone ever asks. Not that anyone asks. No, Virginia said bitterly. No one asks. Virginia thought about this constantly. She was searching for a way to disrupt the system, to save Marcus and any other children who would come after him. But every idea she came up with seemed impossible. She couldn't go to the law. The law was controlled by men like her father. She couldn't convince her father to stop. He had been doing this for decades and saw nothing wrong with it. She couldn't even free the children herself because she had no legal authority to do so. In August, her father took an unscheduled trip. He was gone for 3 days and came back with 2 new children, a girl of about 4 and a boy of about 3, both frightened and crying, clinging to each other. Virginia watched from her bedroom window as they were brought to the quarters. The girl had a rag doll clutched in her arms. The boy kept calling for his mother. That night, Virginia made a decision. If she couldn't stop the system directly, she would expose it. She would make it public, force people to see what her father was doing, create a tension and scandal that couldn't be ignored or swept away. Her father's operation depended on secrecy, on no records, no questions, no attention. She would give it all 3. The question was how. The answer came to her a few days later, when her mother mentioned at breakfast that she was planning a trip to Richmond to shop for fabric and visit some relatives. Virginia asked if she could come along. Her mother, pleased that Virginia was taking an interest in domestic matters, agreed readily. Before the trip, Virginia needed evidence. She needed something more than just her own testimony, which could be dismissed as the imaginings of a hysterical girl. She needed documents, records, proof. She waited for a day when both her parents were out, her father supervising the late summer harvest in the far fields, her mother visiting a sick friend in the next county. Then, Virginia went into her father's study and picked the lock on his desk drawer. It was easier now than the first time she'd done it years ago. She had practiced. The brown leather ledger was exactly where she knew it would be. Virginia pulled it out and began copying entries into a notebook she had brought for this purpose. Not all the entries. That would take hours. Just enough to show the pattern. Names, approximate ages at acquisition, where they came from, physical descriptions, training progress, and most damning, the margin notes. Initials that she realized were coded buyer references, dates, and amounts. PG, Charleston, 800, MR, Memphis, 1000, JW, Savannah, 750, HC, New Orleans, 950. The entries went back years, decades. Virginia's hand was cramping by the time she finished copying, but she had everything she needed. Names, dates, amounts, buyer codes, evidence. She was just replacing the ledger when she heard footsteps in the hall. Her heart leaped into her throat. She shoved the drawer closed, too hard it made a loud bang, pocketed her notebook, and stood up just as the door opened. It was her father. Virginia. He looked surprised to see her. His eyes went immediately to his desk, to the drawer, and narrowed. "What are you doing in my study?" Virginia's mind raced. Her notebook felt like it was burning a hole in her pocket. "I was looking for writing paper," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "I wanted to write a letter to Catherine." Thomas Hartley studied her for a long moment. Virginia held her breath. Could he tell she was lying? Did he notice that his drawer wasn't quite closed all the way? She forced herself to meet his eyes, to not look guilty. Finally, he said, "Paper is in the secretary in the parlor. You know that." "I forgot," Virginia said. She moved toward the door. Her father didn't stop her, but she felt his eyes on her back as she left. Her skin prickled. That night, Virginia couldn't sleep. She lay awake wondering if her father suspected anything, if he had checked his drawer, if he was at that moment discovering that his ledger had been disturbed. But the next day passed normally, and the day after that. Her father said nothing. Virginia began to breathe easier. The trip to Richmond came in late August. Virginia and her mother left on a Tuesday morning, taking the carriage with 2 of the enslaved men to drive and attend them. The journey took most of the day, the roads rutted and dusty in the late summer heat. Virginia clutched her bag, with her copied notes hidden inside, and tried to calm her racing heart. Once they arrived in Richmond and Virginia's mother went off to visit relatives, Virginia excused herself, saying she wanted to look at the bookshop. Instead, she made her way to the offices of the Richmond Examiner, one of the more progressive papers in the city. She had chosen it carefully after reading copies her father brought home, and noting which papers had published articles critical of the slave trade. The office was a cramped, ink-smelling space above a printer's shop on Main Street. Virginia climbed the narrow stairs, her heart hammering, and knocked on the door. A young man answered, maybe 25, with ink stains on his fingers and a harried expression. "Can I help you?" "I need to speak to a reporter," Virginia said. "I have information about illegal slave trading." The young man's expression sharpened immediately. "Come in." She was led to a small office where an older man sat behind a desk, covered in papers, proofs, and what looked like several unfinished cups of coffee. He stood when Virginia entered and introduced himself as Edmund Parker, the editor. He was perhaps 50, with graying hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. Virginia sat down and without preamble told him everything. She described following her father to the building in the woods. She described the transaction she had witnessed, the thin man with the ferret face, the wagon, Samuel being taken away. She showed him her notebook with the copied entries from her father's ledger, all the names, the dates, the amounts, the coded buyer references. Parker listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes. When Virginia finished, he sat back and studied her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "This is serious," he said finally. "You understand what you're accusing your own father of, Miss Hartley?" "I'm not accusing. I'm telling you what's happening." "Semantics. If I publish this, your father will be arrested and tried. Your family will be destroyed. Your name will be dragged through every newspaper in Virginia. You'll be known as the daughter who betrayed her father. Some people will call you courageous. Many more will call you a traitor. Are you prepared for that?" Virginia met his eyes. "Yes." Parker studied her for a moment longer, then looked down at her notebook. "These buyer codes. You're sure your father keeps the key to them somewhere?" "He must. He's too methodical not to." "The building in the woods. You could find it again?" "Yes." "And you witnessed an actual transaction? Child, money exchanged, the works?" "Yes." Parker nodded slowly. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street below. Virginia waited, barely breathing. "I believe you," he said finally, turning back to her. "But belief isn't enough. I need proof that will stand up in court. I can't just publish accusations based on one person's testimony, even with these notes. Your father would sue me for libel. The paper would be ruined, and nothing would change. We have to do this right. What do you need?" "Independent verification. I need to send someone to observe and document an actual transaction. With evidence, testimony from my reporter, photographs if possible. We'd have an airtight case." Virginia felt cold dread settle in her stomach. That could take months. Father only makes these trips quarterly. The next one isn't until September. Then we wait until September. Another child will disappear. Parker's expression was sympathetic but firm. "Miss Hartley, I understand your urgency. I truly do. But if I publish this without solid evidence, your father will destroy us both, and the operation will continue. We have one chance to do this right. We can't waste it by moving too quickly." Virginia wanted to argue, wanted to insist there had to be another way, but she knew he was right. She gave him the date of her father's next expected trip. the second week of September, and described the location of the building in the woods as precisely as she could, referencing landmarks and distances from the main road. Parker promised to send a reporter to observe and document everything. "If we can confirm even one transaction," he said, "we'll publish the full story. Your father's operation will be shut down, he'll face criminal charges, and hopefully we can track down some of the buyers too. But Miss Hartley," he paused, making sure she was listening, "you need to prepare yourself. When this breaks, your life will never be the same. Your family will be destroyed. You'll likely be disowned. Are you absolutely certain you want to do this?" Virginia thought about the 43 names carved into the beam above her window. She thought about Samuel's confused face as he was led to the wagon. She thought about Marcus, who had less than 6 months before he turned 12. She thought about all the children who would come after him if someone didn't stop this. "Yes," she said, "I'm certain." She returned home with her mother that evening, and for the next 2 weeks lived in an agony of tension. She went through her routines mechanically, always wondering if her father suspected anything, if Parker's reporter would really show up, if the plan would work. She felt like she was living on the edge of a knife, balanced between hope and terror. In early September, Thomas Hartley announced at breakfast that he would be traveling to Richmond on September 12th. Virginia's hands tightened on her teacup so hard she thought it might shatter. September 12th. That was it. That was the day everything would either succeed or fall apart. September 12th dawned clear and hot, the kind of day that promised to be sweltering by mid-morning. Virginia watched from her bedroom window as her father rode off just after 6. She spent the morning in agony, unable to eat, unable to focus on anything. Her mother commented that she looked pale and suggested she rest. Virginia retreated to her room and paced like a caged animal. What was happening out there in the woods? Was Parker's reporter in position? Would they be able to document everything? What if her father noticed he was being watched? What if something went wrong? The hours crawled past. Noon came and went. Virginia's mother knocked on her door around 2 o'clock, concerned, but Virginia claimed a headache and asked to be left alone. She sat by her window and stared out at the long drive, waiting. Her father returned just before sunset. Virginia watched him dismount, hand his horse to one of the grooms, and walk into the house with his usual brisk stride. He looked exactly the same as always. Nothing seemed wrong. Had the plan failed? Had Parker's reporter not shown up? Virginia barely slept that night. The next morning at breakfast, her father seemed normal. No hint that anything unusual had happened. Virginia's hopes began to sink. Something had gone wrong. It had to have gone wrong, or surely her father would be acting differently. But then, 3 days later, everything exploded. The story broke in the Richmond Examiner on September 15th, 1851. The headline was printed in letters so large Virginia could read them from across the room. Prominent Virginia planter accused of operating secret child trading ring, decades of illegal sales exposed. Virginia's mother screamed when she saw it. The sound brought Virginia running from her room. She found her mother in the parlor, the newspaper shaking in her hands, her face white as chalk. "Thomas!" she shrieked. "Thomas, come here right now." Virginia's father came from his study, already moving fast. He had clearly heard the scream. He took one look at the newspaper and went very still. His face drained of color. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then her mother turned to look at Virginia, and Virginia saw understanding dawn in her eyes. "You," she whispered, "you did this." "Someone had to," Virginia said quietly. What followed was chaos. Her father shouting, demanding to know what Virginia had told the newspaper. Her mother weeping and hysterical, calling Virginia a traitor, a betrayer, asking how she could do this to her own family. Virginia standing her ground, voice shaking but words steady, saying that she couldn't let it continue, that 43 children had disappeared and she wouldn't let there be a 44th. Sheriff Boone arrived that afternoon with 2 deputies. Virginia watched from the top of the stairs as her father was arrested. Thomas Hartley went quietly, his face rigid with fury and shock. As they led him past the stairs, he looked up and his eyes met Virginia's. The look he gave her was one of pure hatred. Virginia forced herself not to look away. The trial began 6 weeks later, in November. The courtroom in Richmond was packed every day. The public gallery, the press section, every available space filled with curious observers who came to see the spectacle of a daughter testifying against her father. The prosecution built their case methodically. They had Edmund Parker's reporter, who testified about what he had witnessed in the woods on September 12th. They had photographs, grainy daguerreotypes that nonetheless clearly showed Virginia's father exchanging money with the thin man, showed a child being led to a wagon, showed the building itself. They had Virginia's testimony about what she had seen and heard. They had the testimony of Dinah and other enslaved people from the plantation, who spoke reluctantly but truthfully about the pattern of disappearances. Most damning, they had the ledgers themselves. The sheriff had seized them when he arrested Virginia's father, and they provided incontrovertible evidence of the scheme. Years of entries showing children acquired, trained, and removed with no corresponding sale records, along with the margin notes showing coded transactions worth thousands of dollars. Virginia's father's lawyer tried desperately to build a defense. He argued that his client had every right to dispose of his property as he saw fit. He tried to discredit Virginia, calling her a hysterical girl who had misunderstood innocent business dealings. He tried to suggest that the enslaved people testifying were lying in hopes of gaining freedom. But the evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution even managed to track down some of the buyers through the coded references. Several were granted immunity in exchange for testimony, and what they revealed was worse than Virginia had imagined. The buyers had purchased the children for reasons that ranged from the merely illegal to the genuinely monstrous. Some wanted educated servants and were willing to pay premium prices to avoid their own state's laws against teaching slaves to read. Others wanted children for exploitation that made the courtroom go silent when it was described, even in the carefully euphemistic language required by decorum. Virginia was called to testify on the third day of the trial. She wore a simple gray dress and kept her hands folded to stop them from shaking. The prosecutor led her through her testimony gently when she had first noticed the disappearances, how she had started keeping records, what she had witnessed when she followed her father, why she had decided to go to the newspaper. Then her father's lawyer cross-examined her, and he was not gentle. He accused her of being a rebellious daughter seeking attention. He suggested she had romantic notions about abolition picked up from unsuitable reading material. He implied she was mentally unbalanced, perhaps suffering from hysteria or delusions. He asked her repeatedly why, if she was so concerned about these children, she hadn't spoken to her father directly instead of going behind his back to the press. Virginia answered every question calmly. I did speak to my father. He told me it was none of my concern, and I went to the press because I knew no one else would listen. Who would believe an enslaved person complaining about their treatment? Who would investigate a respected planter based on rumor? The only way to stop what was happening was to make it impossible to ignore. On the fifth day of the trial, Thomas Hartley himself testified. He was calm, almost arrogant on the stand. He admitted to the transactions but claimed he had done nothing wrong. Enslaved people were property, he argued. He had every legal right to sell his property to whomever he wished, at whatever price he could negotiate. If he chose to do so without formal documentation, that was his prerogative as the owner. These people are not children in the sense that white children are children, he said at one point. They are property that must be managed for maximum efficiency and profit. I prepared them according to market demand, just as I might improve any other asset before sale. There is no crime in that. The courtroom erupted. The judge had to bang his gavel repeatedly to restore order. Virginia, sitting in the public gallery, felt sick. But her father had miscalculated badly. By admitting to the undocumented sales, he had inadvertently confessed to tax evasion and failure to register transactions with the county clerk, both criminal offenses. And several of the buyers he had sold to were from states where the children's subsequent treatment violated even the minimal protections afforded to enslaved people. This made him potentially guilty of conspiracy in crimes committed by others. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Thomas Hartley was found guilty on multiple counts: illegal trading in human beings, conspiracy, fraud, and tax evasion. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, a harsh sentence for the time, though one that still felt inadequate to Virginia given the scope of what he had done. In addition, the plantation was seized to pay legal debts and provide compensation to victims. Virginia and her mother were left with almost nothing. Virginia's mother never forgave her. The day after the verdict, she packed her belongings and went to live with her sister in North Carolina, refusing to even say goodbye to Virginia. She sent one letter weeks later, informing Virginia that as far as she was concerned, she had no daughter. Virginia had destroyed the family, ruined the family name, and brought shame on everyone connected to the Hartley name. Virginia moved to Philadelphia in early 1852. She had nowhere else to go. The plantation was being sold off piece by piece. Her father was in prison. Her mother had disowned her. Her name was notorious throughout Virginia. Some people called her a hero, but many more called her a traitor and a betrayer. In Philadelphia, she found work with the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. They had heard about her case. It had been covered extensively in the abolitionist press, and they welcomed her. Virginia began speaking publicly about what had happened, writing articles for abolitionist newspapers, testifying before anti-slavery gatherings. She became known as the Virginia Daughter, the girl who had exposed her own father's crimes. Some of the children who had been sold through her father's operation were tracked down through the trial testimony. A few were returned to their birth families. Most could not be found. They had disappeared into the vast apparatus of slavery, their trails gone cold. Virginia maintained contact with those few who were found, sent them what little money she could spare, tried to help in whatever small ways were available to her. She never married. She never returned to Virginia. She spent the rest of her life working for abolition, and after the Civil War ended, for the rights of freed people. She was never wealthy, never famous beyond abolitionist circles, never entirely at peace with the choices she had made. In her later years, she wrote a memoir. It was published in 1885, when Virginia was 51 years old. She titled it, "The 43 Names, A Daughter's Account of Slavery's Hidden Horrors." In it, she detailed everything: her childhood on the plantation, the names carved into her beam, her investigation, the trial, the aftermath. The memoir included a list of all the names she could remember or had recorded. Every child who had disappeared from Hartley Plantation during her lifetime and before. The list took up 3 full pages of the book. Next to each name, where she knew it, she wrote what had happened to them. Most entries were blank. Most of those children simply vanished into history, their fates unknown. "I write these names so someone will remember," she wrote in the introduction. These children existed. They had lives, however brief and however constrained. They were not just property, though that is how the law defined them. They were human beings, and what was done to them was evil, not the casual, unthinking evil of a system that treated people as things, but the deliberate, calculated evil of men who saw opportunity in that system and exploited it for profit. I could not save most of them. I could only expose what was happening and hope that perhaps, someday, we would build a world where such things were impossible. Virginia Hartley died on November 3, 1893, at the age of 59. She died of pneumonia in a small boarding house in Philadelphia, attended by friends from the Anti-Slavery Society. In her will, she left her papers, including her journals, the original notes she had copied from her father's ledger, and all her correspondence, to the Pennsylvania Historical Society, with instructions that they be preserved as evidence of the particular cruelty of which human beings are capable when they treat other human beings as property. Those papers still exist. They are housed in a temperature-controlled archive in Philadelphia, available to researchers. The beam from Virginia's childhood bedroom was preserved when the Hartley house was demolished in 1878, and it is now in a museum collection. You can see it if you visit the Virginia Historical Society in Richmond, a 12-foot length of wood with 43 names carved into it in careful, childish script, the letters worn but still legible after all these years. Each name represents a life interrupted, a childhood stolen, a person whose story ended at age 12 in ways we can only guess at and hope we're wrong about. The building in the woods was burned down in 1852, shortly after the trial concluded. Whether the fire was set deliberately or started by accident, no one knows. The land it stood on is part of a state park now. Sometimes hikers pass through that clearing and don't know they're walking on ground where terrible transactions once took place, where children were handed over to fates worse than the slavery they already endured. The trial testimony, the ledgers, the photographs, all were preserved as evidence and are now part of the historical record. They provide a window into a specific kind of horror that existed within the larger horror of slavery. A reminder that there were always people willing to exploit the vulnerable for profit, and that systems of oppression create opportunities for the worst impulses of human nature. Virginia Hartley's story raises uncomfortable questions that we still grapple with today. How many other operations like her father's existed? How many other children disappeared without explanation? How many families kept dark secrets that were never exposed? We don't have answers to those questions. History is full of silences, gaps in the record where people were deliberately erased. The 43 names on Virginia's beam represent only what one person could document in one place over one period of time. The true number of children who suffered similar fates is unknowable and unimaginable. But Virginia's decision to act, to speak, to expose what she had been raised not to see, that mattered. It mattered to Marcus, Dinah's son, who lived free in Pennsylvania and had children of his own after Virginia used what little money she had to purchase his freedom. It mattered to the few families who were reunited with children they thought they'd lost forever. It mattered to the historical record, providing documentation of a horror that many would prefer to forget. And perhaps it matters now, as we reckon with the legacies of slavery and systemic oppression, as we confront the ways in which cruelty can become routine, systematic, invisible. Virginia kept finding children who vanished at age 12, and she chose not to look away. She chose to count, to remember, to carve their names where she would see them every day. She chose to act, even knowing the personal cost would be devastating. Sometimes bearing witness is all we can do. Sometimes it's everything. This story shows us that evil often hides in plain sight, protected by systems that benefit from silence and complicity. Virginia Hartley could have looked away. Most people did. She could have told herself it wasn't her problem, wasn't her responsibility, wasn't something she could change. But she chose to see, to document, to act, even knowing it would destroy her own life in the process. What do you think of this story? Do you believe all the truth was revealed in that trial, or do you think there were darker secrets that remained buried? How many other operations like Thomas Hartley's existed in the shadows of American slavery? Leave your comments below. I read every one, and I love hearing your theories and thoughts. If you want more historical mysteries like this one, stories that shine light into the darkest corners of our past, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who appreciates these difficult but important chapters of history. These stories need to be told. These names need to be remembered. We owe that much to the 43 children whose names Virginia carved into that beam, and to all the others whose names were never recorded at all. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next video.